So the first step is to measure out about 1.1 milliliters of the guaiacol. And we see a little bubble in there. Let's flip it over, remove the bubble, and check our amount. We'll take another 0.6 roughly. This time we did not get any air in there. Okay, let's now add our ethanol and our boiling chip. Okay, next we'll add our sodium hydroxide, giving this a little mix first. And now we're ready to do the initial reflux. So we've got the water coming in the bottom of the condenser and going out the top into the sink. We want to make sure we have a small amount of grease along the top of the attachment point, the ground glass joint. Okay, that way we don't lose any vapors from our reaction mixture while we're refluxing. We're using a lab jack so we can easily remove the heat if necessary. I'm just going to spin this around to make sure we're getting a nice seal with the grease. Okay. And one technique that works well is actually to remove some sand prior to elevating it and then pour the sand back in. But we'll see how well we do in terms of getting a reflux here with that amount of contact. We also have additional sand we could just pour on top. Let's add a little bit. So now we're going to measure out 1 milliliter of the 3-chloro-1,2-propane diol in 1 milliliter of our 95% ethanol. A little too much there. And to mix the two in this graduated cylinder. Now you may wonder why I didn't just pour it into the graduated cylinder, but they're a little inaccurate when you're dealing with quantities 1 milliliter or less. The amount of solvent isn't critical, so I am going to use this and just measure out about 1 additional milliliter on top of that. Give it a little swirl. And we'll now go check on our round bottom flask and see if we've started the refluxing. So we could see that it is boiling, and if you look closely, you see some condensing on the very tip of the condenser and dripping back down. Now let's go ahead and add the 3-chloro-1,2-propane-diol in 1 milliliter of the 95% ethanol to our round bottom flask containing the phenoxide anion. Dropwise, we're just going to go ahead and do it from the top of the reflux condenser. Get that as far down as possible. And now we'll let that reflux for 30 minutes. So now we are waiting for the evaporation of the ethanol before we go to the next step, which is the extraction. We're going to mark at the initial level just so we get a sense when we've got about half the original liquid, most of our ethanol evaporated away. So we've removed most of the ethanol and the sand bath. And now if we are able to look on the bottom of the round bottom flask, we can see that there are some white solids there. Now we're going to add about 6 milliliters of water to dissolve the precipitated NaCl. And we're going to add this mixture to our separatory funnel. Of course, we always want to make sure that stopcock is closed. So now we have the water in here, and we can add it to our sep funnel. I place a little bit of glass wool here to catch the boiling stones. We'll give this a little swirl. We want to dissolve most of that salt. You can see it's mostly all gone. I'll give it a little rinse with water as well. And now we want to add our 2 15 ml portions of ethyl acetate, one at a time. So these solvent volumes can be approximate. There's no reason to do close measurement, but we do have about 15 mils, 16 or so. I'm going to pour that in. And now we'll invert. Make sure there's not any gas buildup. And remove the stopcock to help speed the separation of the layers. And it might take a little bit here, but you can see now we're starting to get clearly defined layers. And I've got an Erlenmeyer labeled with aqueous here. We're going to go ahead and drain the aqueous. We could wait a little longer, but we're going to extract again, and we're also going to dry the organic, so it's not super critical at this point. And there's a little technique you can use here when you get really close to the end. Just give it a good flip. Right. And then what we want to do, ideally you kind of rinse, make sure all the water is down, but again we're going to dry this organic with some saturated sodium chloride, but we're still going to follow our good technique of pouring the organic out the other end, not to go down the same end as our aqueous. Put the aqueous back in. Give it a little rinse. Okay, and then we're going to extract that with another 15 milliliters or so of our ethyl acetate. Remove the stopcock, and again wait for the layers to separate. Alright, we're pretty close there. I'm going to start to drain the aqueous first. And this time I'm going to give it a little swirl, make sure there's no aqueous up there. Okay, let that separate. Drain out the last little bit of water. Little flip, like so. Set our aqueous aside. Now, going to again, now I can just simply add the remainder of the organic from the previous extraction back in the sub funnel. And you can see it's cloudy. Okay, that's probably some water suspended in the solution. And to further dry out our organic before adding our drying agent, we're going to wash it with saturated NaCl. So I've got 10 mils here. Doesn't have to be super precise again. This is going to help minimize the amount of drying agent. We don't want to have to add a mountain of drying agent to our organic layer, because the more drying agent we add, the more opportunity for product loss. And since we're only doing one wash with the sodium chloride, we're going to give it a nice amount of time for those layers to separate. And that looks good. I'm going to add the NaCl to the other aqueous container, and I'm going to pour the organic into a fresh Erlenmeyer flask. Again, trying to get any water remaining off the walls. We don't want to carry that through. and a little flip. And now we put this in a new dry container, which will add our magnesium sulfate. Hopefully we won't have to add too much since we had that extra step of the sodium chloride. It's looking pretty chunky still. So let's add a little bit more. Another spatula tip. See if we can get some free-flowing powder. Borderline. I'm going to add just one more spatula tip and then we'll let it sit. You see some clumping, but you also see some powder in there. Okay, it doesn't poof up quite as nicely in ethyl acetate, but let's let it sit now and then we'll filter and evaporate. So now we're going to gravity filter our combined ethyl acetate dried organic layer into a round bottom flask for rotary evaporation. So we're folding the filter paper in half and then into quarters and then into eighths. And put it in like so. And we just want to make sure when we add the liquid it doesn't go above that lip, because then it will miss the filter paper. And ideally you want to take a little bit of your solvent that you're working with and wet the filter paper so that it kind of stays in place prior to adding your dried solvent. Now, we've also got some product trapped in that drying agent. I'm just going to add maybe another couple mils, give it a tiny rinse, and pour that in as well. Now once that finishes draining, we'll be ready to take that to the rotary evaporator. So again, I just want to make sure there's enough grease here near the top to provide a nice seal. When I turn this, I need to see a nice clear band, a little bit more grease. Okay, now I'm seeing a nice band along the top, meaning that I have it sealed. My clip, turn on my pump, get it spinning. Whether or not you get it spinning before or after the pump's on doesn't really matter. I'm going to go over here and going to close my vacuum. Now I just opened the vacuum a tiny bit because the boil started to get a little too vigorous. I don't want it to bump and shoot into that trap. You can see it start to drip over here, condensing on the coils. We're just going to let it go for a little while. I'm not even going to warm it up or put it in the warm water bath until that boiling completely stops. Now that it's stopped, I'll just warm it gently with my hand. And then I'm going to lower it very slowly, since we got quite a bit of vigorous boil before, very slowly into the water bath, which is set to 40 degrees Celsius. And again, we're looking for consistency and volume. And then pump on it for another minute or two once we get a consistent volume. I'm actually going to turn up the water bath just a little bit here to speed up the process. Make sure we've gotten rid of all our ethyl acetate. I've turned it up to 55 degrees Celsius. It's going to take a little while to get there, but that'll just finish it off a little more efficiently. So it looks like the volume hasn't changed for a little bit. So we're just going ahead and put it back in there and pump on it for one more minute, and then we'll go on to the next step in the experiment. All right. Okay, so I've got it set up here to go into an ice bath. We're going to add our hexanes. I'm first going to try and clean out that grease from the rotary evaporator. We don't want to get that into our product. Okay, then I'm going to lower it into the ice bath, place a stir bar, and add our 10 mils of hexanes. So we lowered it a little further into the ice bath to get better stirring motion, and after just a little bit we could see that we've got precipitate. So here we have our Buchner funnel filtration setup. Buchner funnel. We have this set of sidearm flasks to make sure that no solvent is sucked into the vacuum line. Set our filter paper on top. You always want to wet that filter paper down with a little bit of the solvent you're going to be rinsing your product with, just to make sure that filter paper is nicely affixed to the Buchner funnel. And then we can go ahead and try to dump out our product. You'll see we'll need to break it up maybe a little bit with the glass rod here. Well, it's starting to come there. Add a little cold hexanes to help it along here. Give it a little swirl and dump. It's kind of the technique you want. Another tiny rinse with hexanes. Trying to get as much as possible here. And it's got quite a low melting point, so really we're just going to, and the hexanes also is very volatile, so we really just want to break it up a little bit on the filter paper without having it fly out. And we're going to let that dry on the piece of filter paper instead of putting it into an oven. Oops, lost a little bit there.
maintaining the mass of the crude guaifenesin.
So here we have our crude. We're going to add it to an Erlenmeyer via this powder funnel. And we've got ethyl acetate on the hot plate, slowly heating up. That should come to a boil before we start to add it. And what we're going to do is we want to break this up into as small particle size as we can to make sure that when we're adding the hot ethyl acetate, we do add the minimum amount required to dissolve. And when you have very large particles, they dissolve much more slowly, so the chances of adding too much ethyl acetate increases versus small particles. So I'm just going to crush this up a little before we start adding the ethyl acetate. Okay, so now we've got the product, crude product, a little more powdery, and we've got our ethyl acetate boiling. Again, we want to just make sure we get a nice minimum amount of hot ethyl acetate in here to dissolve the crude before we add our hexanes. And now I'm gonna give it a little swirl and see if we could break out some of these chunks before adding any more. And usually that process should go a little slower. Probably added a little bit too much ethyl acetate too quickly. What we could do now is reduce the volume of ethyl acetate, but since we're using a second solvent to precipitate it, let's go ahead to that step and hopefully we'll be successful. Okay, so now we're going to add the hexanes till we get a persistent cloudiness. And you can see it a little bit cloudy there as I add it directly, but it's not remaining. Okay, so we're gonna add more, swirl that around a little bit. You can see that cloudiness persisting a little bit longer. Okay, give it a little mix. Still, cloudiness is going away. So we're going to add another couple mils here. Okay, give it a swirl. And almost there, so close. All right. So now we're going to let that sit for 15 minutes or so. So after letting it sit for about 10 minutes, we did the last 5 minutes in the ice bath. And you can see all these beautiful crystal deposits along the bottom. So we put our filter paper in here. Again, we want to wet it down with a bit of the solvent we're going to wash with. And you can do this before or after the vacuum's on, really, it doesn't matter too much. And then we're going to give this a little swirl to break it up. And get a spatula here. And then we're just going to give a little swirl and dump. Ideally, you would want a completely uniform solid like this powder here, but this is what we've got. So here we have our dried Guaifenesin product. Going to tear the watch glass. Got most of it there.